Good morning. I am Alex Kershaw, a member of the Board of Directors of the National World War II Memorial and the author of several books about World War II, including The First Wave, The D-Day Warriors Who Led the Way to Victory in World War II, and The Bedford Boys. Thank you for joining us virtually to commemorate the 76th anniversary of the June 6, 1944 D-Day invasion, when the Allies launched Operation Overlord by invading German-occupied France along the coast of Normandy, the largest amphibious invasion in history. The Friends of the National World War II Memorial, your host for this morning's ceremony, is a small non-profit organisation whose mission is to honour and preserve the national memory of World War II and to create the next greatest generation of tomorrow. To meet this mission, Friends sponsors an annual public lecture series featuring prominent historians, hosts an annual teachers' conference in Washington, D.C., and collects and archives video interviews of World War II veterans and other members of the greatest generation. Also, Friends is the only organisation hosting a full 4-year 75th anniversary commemoration, marking every major battle in which American troops participated during World War II. Friends is, crucially, also charged with the immense and honoured responsibility of designing and funding the addition of President Franklin Delano Roosevelt's D-Day prayer to the World War II Memorial. Friends is leading the effort to raise the estimated $2 million needed for this most important undertaking. As a non-profit organisation, Friends relies on contributions large and small to renew and reinvigorate the spirit of unity and shared purpose that defined the character of our country during the war years, in the hopes of creating the next greatest generation of tomorrow. I want to celebrate in particular one individual from the over 150,000 Allied troops who landed on D-Day, June the 6th, 1944, Lieutenant John Spalding. He was a platoon commander in E Company of the 16th Infantry Regiment of the Big Red One. He'd never seen combat, so D-Day was his first day in action, so to speak. He was very, very afraid of what might happen to him on D-Day because he knew that he was going to land in the first wave. In fact, he did land in the first wave as with E Company. He landed on easy red sector of Omaha Beach, which is one of 8 sectors on Omaha Beach. It unfortunately proved to be the second deadliest place that you could land on Omaha Beach. Over 900 Americans were killed on bloody Omaha in the first hours of the invasion. When the ramp came down on his landing craft, he went into the water, very rough water, 5 or 6 feet high. His head went under the water. He had a very heavy pack on his back. He managed to get rid of the pack, and then when his head finally got above water and he could breathe, he said his uniform felt like lead. It was dragging him down so much. He managed to wade under enormous fire towards easy red sector of the beach, the sand of Omaha Beach itself. Unfortunately, he hit a runnel, and there are many very deep runnels running along Omaha Beach. He hit a runnel and went under the water and was about 2 or 3 feet under the water. He struggled somehow, he said, to get back to the surface, managed to take a breath of air, and then waded to the shore. He and E Company were pinned down on Omaha Beach, suffering high casualties and very, very intense machine gun fire for around about half an hour. Finally, Spalding realized that the only way that he stood a chance of living, and the only way that his men stood a chance of surviving this incredibly intense fire, was to actually get up from the beach, walk into, or rather run into the line of fire and try and get off the beach. This is very, very important if E Company were to have any survivors, and in fact, if the entire operation on Omaha Beach was to be a success. Men pinned under murderous fire had to get off that beach, push inland, and destroy the German defences. But it took enormous courage when you are seeing your friends being killed around you, when you are under such incredibly accurate fire that even if you move your head a few inches, you could be killed by a sniper or machine gun bullets. It took enormous courage to be able to stand up and lead men off that, out of that slaughterhouse, basically. That's what Lieutenant John Spalding did. 29 years old, never been in combat before, a sports writer from Owensboro, Kentucky before the war, hadn't seen his child for a couple of years, a man who had never seen war before. He led his men, he shouted at them, he screamed at them, and he led his men off Omaha Beach and then up around about 150 yards of bluffs. The bluffs above Omaha were about 90 to 100 feet, and all along those bluffs, along the 5.5 miles of Omaha Beach, there were many, many machine guns, 88mm artillery, mortars, you name it, but the machine guns were the ones that caused most of the death on Omaha. Along the 150 yards or so of the bluff that he had to climb was a minefield. John Spalding led his men through a minefield under enormous, very intense fire, and finally, having landed at 6:30 a.m. on Omaha Beach, around about 8 o'clock in the morning, after an hour and a half of hell, he managed to lead 18 men from the 1st Platoon of E Company, 16th Infantry Regiment of the Big Red One, off Omaha Beach and through the bluffs and into the open ground at the top of Omaha Beach, which today is the Colville-sur-Mer graveyard where 9,500 Americans rest in eternal peace. So the reason why I've picked John Spalding is because he was the first American officer to lead Americans off the bloodiest beach on D-Day, and his courage, his integrity, his guts made a big difference all along that very, very intense and bloody battlefield, which was Omaha Beach on June the 6th, 1944. It took men like John Spalding, people who had never been in war before, it took them to be able to turn what looked like a disaster into ultimately an important victory for the Allies on D-Day. Perhaps 3 or 4 dozen young Americans, junior officers, sergeants, made all the difference on that beach on June the 6th, 1944. Point being that courage sometimes matters. It matters a great, great deal. He miraculously survived the war. In March of 1945, he was interviewed at great length in one of the first great oral histories performed by the US military during the war itself. And he said that he believed that he was immortal after he'd survived the carnage on Omaha Beach, because only someone who was immortal could have miraculously have survived what he went through in the early hours of June the 6th, 1944. And he said as he went through that minefield, he had an angel literally on each shoulder looking after him. The 18 men that went through that minefield, none of them were wounded by mines. And in fact, a few hours later, when another group of Americans went along the very same path, and you've just seen the shot of that, what's now known as the Spalding Path, several men were killed and wounded. So for 18 men to get off that beach and then not be killed by mines and finally break out was indeed a miracle on D-Day. Spalding carried on fighting with the 16th Infantry Regiment through the bloodbath of Normandy. Over 20,000 Americans were killed in the bloodiest battle of World War II, the Battle for Normandy. And finally, by the end of the battle, he had reached the outskirts of Paris in late August of 1944. Spalding carried on with the 1st Division. He carried on through September of 1944 in the very intense battles around Aachen on the German border, and then finally he was wounded badly in the Hurtgen, and then later in the spring of 1945 he finally was pulled out of the line. He had basically suffered exhaustion and mental breakdown after spending so long in combat. Spalding, like many veterans from World War II, many of those who fought on D-Day, suffered severe PTSD for the rest of his life and never ever got over what had happened to him during World War II, and in particular the trauma and carnage of D-Day. He did his duty, he performed something of a miracle on D-Day, and I think it's his spirit and courage and endurance and the ability to be able to sacrifice so much, to give so much, that we should celebrate today. It wasn't just Spalding who gave his all, it was countless thousands of Allied troops who gave everything, including their lives, to begin to liberate Western Europe on what was called the longest day, but certainly was perhaps the most important day of the 20th century. Thank you very much for joining the Friends of the National World War II Memorial this D-Day morning, a very important day in world history. Next June of 2021, I hope you'll consider joining me and the Friends as I lead a tour of London, Normandy and Paris and follow the Allied route from Portsmouth across the Channel to Ouistreham and then to Normandy to pay tribute to our brave Allied service members. Actually, we'll be there on Omaha Beach in Normandy next June 6th, 2021 to celebrate those amazing men in the very place where they fought and died for our freedoms. But today, we pause and join together, remembering the more than 2 million Allied service members who took part in Operation Overlord, and the more than 225,000 Allies who were killed, wounded or missing, including 10,000 Allied troops killed on D-Day. They are not to be forgotten ever. Thank you for joining us.